So hello and welcome to this NPTEL course entitled Feminist Writings. We're looking at Judith Butler's Gender Trouble. So we're looking at the first chapter in some details, and they should be on your screen highlighted in yellow, the sections that we're studying specifically. So we saw how Butler talks about the whole problem of a binaristic understanding of gender and how that becomes a sense of totalitarian narrative which constricts and represses identity production, which represses agency production, etc., and how she sort of tried to move beyond that and looking at a more fluid understanding of gender as performance, as something which is performatively produced and not with something of a biological essence. So the movement away is from essentialism to performativity. That's the movement that Butler is advocating and sort of calibrating and examining in this work. Now, and then we find, if you look at Butler's definition of gender, we find how it's sort of Derridian in quality. There's a lot of post-structuralism which is getting into this definition. There's a lot of post-structuralist, deconstructionist discourse and vocabulary the Butler is appropriating. And this is what she says, and this should be on the screen, where she's saying, gender is a complexity whose totality is permanently deferred, never fully what it is at any given juncture in time. An open coalition then will affirm identities that are alternately instituted and relinquished according to the purposes at hand. It'll be an open assemblage that permits of multiple convergences and divergences without obedience to a normative telos of definitional closure. So the vocabulary is so Derridian. The whole idea of being permanently deferred is this is a Derridian idea of deconstruction, deferring and differing. And as a process, you come up with this compound word deference, which is a combination of deferring and differing. And it's never really full at any given juncture in time. So at any given juncture in time, it's always moving, it's always mutable in quality. And this mutability is something which is a marker of gender. So the totality of any gender identity is mutable at any given point of time, and that always moves ahead, forward, backwards, in all kinds of uncertain, unpredictable patterns. And then Butler is Butler is inviting an open coalition where it's all opened up and it invites coalition, invites participation, all kinds of identity productions. And then that open coalition will affirm identities that are alternatively instituted and relinquished according to the purpose at hand. It'll be an open assemblage. The word assemblage is very important because it almost gives a sense of machinic assemblage. You assemble machines, you assemble together things and give it a sense of metonymic quality. An open assemblage that permits of multiple convergences and divergences. The whole idea of converging and diverging all the time gives the whole process of gender a centripetal and centrifugal identity. So it's always moving ahead, moving outside of the center and moving towards the center because there is no stable center. So we move away from a centered idea of gender into a more decentered idea of gender, a more distributive, fluid understanding of gender. And that's something that Butler is advocating and summoning. So it permits of multiple convergences and divergences without obedience to any normative telos of definitional closure. So there's no definitional closure. It's a closure killing mechanism that categorizes the whole idea of gender. It's a closure killer. It's something which is subversive to gender, subversive to any idea of gendered closure or normativity in that sense. So normativity, closure, all these are done away with in this kind of model, a complex model of deferring and differing, a complex model of open coalition, a complex model of open assemblage. So these adjectives, these words are very important: coalition, assemblage, deferred, because these are the markers of gender according to Butler. And we can see clearly how the vocabulary is so post-structuralist in quality. I mean, this is very Derridian in quality, and Butler obviously becomes, she crystallizes in a way in her work the theories of post-structuralism with experience of gender together, and that's what makes the work so foundational in quality in terms of gender studies as we study today. Okay, so and then she goes on to say the whole idea of personhood. So personhood is a productive process. So there's no innate quality of personhood. Personhood is something which is always productive. It hasn't been produced all the time, and if something is produced, that can also be deproduced and reproduced. So there's a textual quality about personhood. There's a textual quality about producing personhood, which Butler is advocating over here. And this textual quality is something that she's very clearly highlighting in her understanding of gender. As she says over here, this should be on the screen highlighted in yellow, where she's saying persons only become intelligible through becoming gendered in conformity with recognizable standards of gender intelligibility. So, you know, there are certain recognizable parameters, certain permitted parameters of gender, and you can only become a person recognized by society if you are subscribing and conforming to that kind of predictable pattern of gender. If you're not, then you become a transgressor, then you become a deviant, and that's something which is, you know, it can potentially be subversive in quality, but then you don't have a personhood in the normative sense of the word, unless you're conforming to certain set models of gender intelligibility or gender understanding. Okay, so and that's something which Butler is obviously moving away from, the whole idea of stable, gendered understanding, and then obviously what she wants essentially is a more subversive, distributive, more fluid understanding of gender in the world we live in today. Okay, so and then she's talking about, and this should be on the screen, she's talking about how women become an impossible category in this kind of a discursive situation, because women can never be in complete conformity to that certain parameter, because that parameter is very phallocentric in quality, is very male in quality, is very patriarchal, obviously, it's a patriarchal production. So women will always fall short of that category, will always fall short of that kind of a, you know, permitted qualities, and this is what she says, and this should be on the screen highlighted in yellow, where she's saying women can never be according to this ontology of substance, precisely because they are the relation of difference. So, you know, women are not really substance, they are difference, because they differ from the normative model, they differ from the normative angle, and that difference makes them potentially subversive, but at the same time the difference makes them other in quality. So they are the relations of difference, they're excluded, by which the domain marks itself off. So women are always excluded, they are different, they're excluded from the domain, and that domain, of course, is very, very phallocentric in quality. Women are also a difference that cannot be understood as a simple negation or other of the always already masculine subject. So it's not really a simple negation, it's not really a straightforward negation of the always already masculine subject. If you look at the adjective always already, so always has a temporal quality, already, again, it is a temporal quality, and the whole idea of always already compounded together makes it a permanent thing. So man is the permanent subject, as a permanently available, the permanently recognizable subject, and that permanent recognizability, the permanent visibility of the male obviously makes the woman the other. But then, you know, what Butler is saying, that woman cannot be seen as a simple other or simple negation of that permanent visibility of male. As discussed earlier, they're neither is subject nor is other, but a difference from the economy of binary opposition, itself a ruse for a monologic elaboration of the masculine. So the binary opposition of male versus female is a ruse, as a trick, is something, you know, created by the elaboration, the monologic elaboration of the masculine, and that monologic quality is something which produces the binary, etc. But then what is also important to understand is that women are not really the other in the binary, the women are the difference in the binary, and difference is a process. The other is more or less an identity, the other is, has a degree of stability to it, but difference is a process of producing you know, otherness, and so that is something Butler is more interested in, difference rather than other, right? So other with a capital O is something that Butler is not quite comfortable with, because she thinks it's an inadequate understanding of the woman, but a more adequate, a more full, a more complex understanding of woman should be through the model of difference, so yeah, difference from the economy of binary opposition, right? And that binary opposition itself is a ruse for the monologic elaboration of the masculine. And that's something that she is saying quite clearly over here. So we see how deeply post-structuralist Butler's idea of gender is, how deeply post-structuralist Butler's idea of the woman is, and the whole idea of woman becoming the difference, and there's a Derridan quality to it, differing as well as deferring. So it's a deference that we're talking about. It's always different, it's always deferred. It never really arrives at a fuller understanding, at a fuller appropriation of the coveted identity, but rather it's always an incomplete, liminal and fluid understanding of identity that is, you know, processed through woman. Now, having said all that, how does Butler define gender? So what is the definition of gender? And then the linguistic definition of gender, and I use the word linguistic quite literally because Butler is about to give us, you know, what part of speech gender is. what kind of, whether it's a verb or a noun or an adjective or what. How does gender fit into the scheme of things, linguistically speaking? And this is a very good example of how textuality and experientiality merge. And that's something which we talked about throughout this course already, and that's one of the key things that we are keen on elaborating, examining, and calibrating in this course: the relationship, the entanglement of textuality and experientiality. And this is what Butler says about gender, and this should be on your screen. What is she saying? In this sense, gender is not a noun, but neither is it a sort of free-floating attributes. For we have seen that a substantive effect of gender is performatively produced and compelled by the regulatory practices of gender coherence. Hence, within the inherited discourse of the metaphysics of substance, gender proves to be performative, that is, constituting the identity it is purported to be. In this sense, gender is always a doing, though not a doing by a subject who might be said to pre-exist the deed, right? So gender is always a verb. It's doing, it's something which is performative in quality. And now, performativity is a very loaded term in Butler, and more often than not, performativity is geared towards producing an affect. Now, affect could be any kind of affect. It could be awe, it could be fear, it could be adoration, it could be celebration, it could be hero worship, it could be anything. But performativity is something which is affect producing. It's an affect producing mechanism, right? So gender is not a noun. Gender is a process of becoming, a process of doing. It's a verb. It's an activity, and that activity is an affective activity. So gender as an affective activity is something that Butler is interested in as a theorist and a philosopher of gender. And then she goes on to say, there is no gender identity behind expression of gender. That identity is performatively constituted by the very expression that is said to be its results, right? So there is no gender identity behind expression of gender. There's no one palpable, tangible gender identity, expression of gender, behind the expression of gender. But what we have, that identity is constantly and performatively produced and constituted by expressions, right? So expressions, activities, utterances, iterations. So these are things which produce gender identities, and that production becomes a very important category for Butler, rather than looking at any innate understanding, any innate idea of gender as some kind of a substance, right? So the movement away is from a metaphysics of substance to a performative model of production. And again, this is very, very postmodernist in quality. It's moving away from any stable, centered understanding, ontological understanding of gender into a more distributive, fluid, and performative understanding of gender that Butler is talking about and advocating in this book, which is what makes it such an important, seminal book for gender studies today. So it's not just about feminism or masculinity, but it connects the whole idea of gender studies very, very compellingly and complexly as we move on and study this through different lenses, whether it's a lens of anthropology, whether it's a lens of literary studies or critical theory or philosophy. You can't really ignore Butler. I mean, she's one of the really foundational figures in this discipline. Now, this chapter ends with what is sort of setting out to define what this text does. And so what is gender trouble about? So she's saying quite clearly that this text continues then as an effort to think through the possibility of subverting and displacing those naturalized and reified notions of gender that support masculine hegemony and heterosexist power. To make gender trouble, though not through the strategies that figure a utopian beyond, but precisely the mobilization, subversive confusion, and proliferation of precisely those constitutive categories that seek to help keep gender in its place by posturing as a foundational illusions of identity. So it's a very loaded sentence with which the first chapter ends. So I'm just going to unpack this a little bit and then wind up. So what is this text about? This text is about the effort to think through the possibility of subverting and displacing. The text offers an example, offers an examination of how to subvert the possibility and these naturalized and reified notions. And what does Butler mean by naturalized and reified notions? So naturalization happens through repetition. You can naturalize something by repeating something, by internalizing something ad infinitum. You keep repeating something, you keep internalizing it, and before you know it, it becomes a natural, seamless process, a naturalized, seamless process. And now that naturalization is also a process of reification. What is reification? Reification is a process in which a thing becomes a commodity, something which becomes internalized and consumed as a commodity. Now, that reification or that naturalization, of course, is completely in bed with, completely collusive with masculine hegemony and heterosexist powers. It's very heteronormative in quality, it's very heterosexist in quality. It discriminates against anything which is non-heteronormative, and that discrimination, that hegemony, that totalitarian control and coercion is very much part of the process of reification, where everything is reified, everything is made into a commodity, a thing that is done through a process of naturalization, which is iteration over and over again. Okay, so, but this book wants to make gender trouble. Now, the word trouble becomes very important over here, because trouble, again, is a verb. Is used by Butler. It wants to open up, it wants to trouble, it wants to unsettle the normative, reified understandings of gender. It wants to unsettle and open up and crack open the possibility of gender as a production process. And this is, of course, the whole idea, the whole scheme of deconstruction. So deconstruction, as we know, is not the destruction of meaning. Deconstruction is a possibility of producing more meanings. Or the possibility of possibility, rather. It is a process through which more meanings may be produced, alternative meanings may be accommodated, articulated, ambivalence may be acknowledged and articulated, right? So that's the whole idea of deconstruction. It opens up to more possibilities in textual productions and reproductions. And that is exactly what Butler wants. So Butler says that I'm not really looking for a utopian beyond. There is a utopia that I'm looking for, but what I'm looking for, what I'm wanting, is mobilization, subversive confusion. So again, a very important term, subversive confusion. It's subversive in quality, it is rebellious in quality, it's something which is supposed to interrogate reified notions of gender. And this confusion is healthy, this is critical confusion. This is a confusion which can produce more meaning, it can produce more possibilities. And Butler is obviously very, very interested in possibilities over here. So it is about subversive confusion, and with that subversion comes the proliferation of precisely those constitutive categories that seek to keep gender in its place by posturing as the foundational illusions of identity, right? So Butler is setting herself against those categories, those constitutive categories that that keep gender in its place by posturing as the foundational illusions of identity. Now, the word posturing is very important over here, because what she's saying essentially is true for any kind of a grand narrative. So any grand narrative will give you, or will pretend to be the foundational narrative of universal identity, right? And that's the whole point of becoming a grand narrative. That's the whole idea. There's a whole process through which something becomes a grand narrative. That it can only become a grand narrative if we can give this illusion about identity, illusion about foundational identity. This is where it starts from. Whereas what is effaced away very, very conveniently and very, very quickly is the constructed quality of grand narratives, or constructed quality of any narrative before it becomes a grand narrative, right? So any act of grand narrative is a process in which the constructed quality is concealed. So you conceal the constructed process, then you appear as a foundational narrative, as a foundational illusion of identity. So it is something which is illusion of identity. It's something which opens up to more identity productions. That's something that Butler is obviously advocating against. She's saying that this is the whole point of troubling gender. I want to make gender trouble, because through the process of troubling, I can critique, interrogate, and deconstruct and unpack all these norms which reify gender and which appear to be totalizing illusions of identity. So it appears to be foundational, it appears to be totalizing, it appears to be universal in quality. But of course, we know that any claim to universality is a false claim, because nothing can be universal, at least in human discourses. So the whole idea of topicality, locality, textuality, constructed quality, all these things become very important in Butler's analysis. And she says the only way in which we can unpack these qualities, the only way in which we can calibrate these qualities is by making gender trouble. And by trouble, she means textualize gender, treat gender as a text, open up gender as a textual mode of production and reproduction and deproduction, and analyze gender, interpret gender as a text. Once you can interpret it, then obviously these plural possibilities will become possible. And the point is, it's not really a utopian beyond that we're looking at. It's not that. But we're looking at the local narratives which can potentially subvert and mobilize and create confusion, critical, healthy confusion, which will then obviously lead on to more subversive narratives in the times to come. Trouble, which is obviously very loaded, very provocative and brilliant, I'm sure you'll agree. And if you think about it, it's one of the really, really important works in gender studies which open up to many different discourses of gender. And among the many things which Butler does is that she combines, very interestingly, this theoretical lens of post-structuralism with the experience of gender, gender as an experience of liminality, gender as an experience of mutability. Now, how do you calibrate that experience? How do you analyze experience? You analyze experience using the post-structuralist perspective, right? So you map the post-structuralist perspective onto the experience of gender, and this mapping becomes an act of rebellion because you use the post-structuralist lens, you use the post-structuralist performance, but only in as much that is used to map the experience of gender in a very, very cogent and compelling way, and a very complex way. That makes gender a trouble, that makes gender a complex phenomenon, that makes gender a very, very important set of attributes which are performative in quality. So with that, we conclude the first chapter of Gender Trouble. We'll move on to the next chapters in the times to come, and we'll hopefully wind up this text very, very soon. Thank you for your attention.